welcome CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs, Ben Pendergrass, and Liaison Program Coordinator and Northwind Regional Director, Mindy Ahler, to the stage to share CCL's legislative goals for the remainder of this congressional session and outline what's on the horizon as a new Congress takes shape. With so much in flux, this discussion will set the stage for how we continue to make a difference together. So please join me in welcoming Mindy and Ben.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody. It's great to be with you here today, Ben. A reminder to all of you that we will have time for questions, so please upvote questions that are already in the Q&A and enter your new questions there. That's the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And one question I'll address quickly before I pass it to you, Ben. As we've been building enthusiasm for the lobby week, I see a few people asking already, how do I join a lobby team? So I'm going to put a link in the chat that you can reach out to your state coordinator, regional director, or your group leader and ask them how you can join a lobby team. So with that, I'm going to pass it to you first, Ben, and get us started, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Thanks, Mindy. Thanks, Rachel. I'm happy to be here and see everybody. It's an exciting time, and the lame duck, I'm a little concerned. Jen's not here today to keep me in line, so we don't know what's going to happen. But we'll start with a little like review of like what's going on in Congress, quickly go over our lobbying asks, and then leave enough time to really have a discussion about next Congress and leave plenty of time for questions. So we'll start off with what's going on in Congress right now? And that's a miracle. I made that work. All right. Well, as has been mentioned, we are in the lame duck. And I feel like Rachel and Senator Curtis have done a lot of the framing around what's going on, and Flannery's been doing a good recap of the roadmap. It's making my job really easy. But what is the lame duck? It's kind of a strange animal. You know, not to be too funny, it's the period after the election when Congress still has stuff they need to do. Time is running out. They usually, unfortunately, leave a lot of important stuff to the end of the year. They don't get it done on time, and they have to wrap everything into this frantic period of time where they've got to do must-pass bills. And this is both a giant headache for a lot of us in DC and a real opportunity. So there's a couple things that Congress still needs to do in this lame duck. They need to fund the government. They need to do a spending CR by the 20th to make sure the government shuts down. And I don't think there's much appetite on any part with any party to shut down the government right now. They need to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, and they might even try to squeeze in a public lands bill, maybe. But what does this mean for us? Well, it's an important opportunity to lock in climate wins. And it's worth noting that a lot of the bills we have passed, gotten over the finish line, usually get over the finish line in the lame duck. So this is a really crucial time. So what are our asks? Our primary ask is the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024. I'm not going to get into all the details here because we've done a lot of trainings on it. I recommend checking out Dana's really deep dive into that bill and all the emissions reductions possible. We have a great panel coming up later with one of the modelers that even did some of those emissions modeling things that we relied on. So we'll be able to get into the details there, not here. But we want you to make this ask in every office. It's really important for all Republicans, all Democrats, House and Senate, everybody to hear your enthusiasm for moving this bill right now. The top line message is please support EPRA. That's what everybody's calling it up here now. You know, we love our acronyms and like shortening and having funny names that nobody knows what they mean. But everybody in DC knows what EPRA is right now. Ask them to pass the bill this Congress. Not co-sponsor, not like move it through committee. We want to see the bill pass this Congress. And what they need to do to have that happen is they need to go to their leadership, Republican, House and Senate, Democratic leadership, and say we want action on this bill now. That's what's going to move this along. So one of the things I just like to always point out, like to reinforce, like why do we want this bill? This is our current path on emissions. This is central estimate for EPRA. This is like the best case. Like this is a bill that really does lower emissions, and that's why we want to move it now and not wait until next Congress. And there is a bipartisan path forward for it. Both sides have a reason they should want to advance the bill now. Democrats get permanent reforms that make building clean energy easier, and especially transmission provisions that we know we need to get clean energy hooked up to the grid. And right now, we know almost 75% of projects that are delayed by permitting are clean energy. So we've got to act on this for climate. Republicans get permitting reforms that they've long supported. I mean, been asking to reform our permitting system for a really long time to build all projects faster. They also get some clarity around onshore leasing of oil and gas provisions, and they get some mining stuff that's not really it's really a bipartisan priority, but it's something that Republicans are very interested in, and they also get some certainty around LNG export permits. Top line message for Democrats: renewable energy stands to benefit greatly from this bill. One of the best ways we can reduce emissions is to build clean energy faster. The world has changed. Clean energy is cheaper, the economics are behind it. Now, one of the greatest barriers is actually permitting reform. Third, we're not really going to be able to hit any of our climate goals unless we start to build out transmission in a really big way, and you're going to hear more about that later. So the message is locking climate wins now by putting steel in the ground. This is the way we're really going to lower emissions, by building things and getting things connected to the grid. Ask your leadership to move this bill by all means now. Top line messaging for Republicans: it makes it easier to build all forms of energy infrastructure. On transmission, it's best to talk about how build out will lower costs and improve reliability for Americans. That's what they're most interested in. And another really important message, especially with the new Congress coming in and unified control, is the message you can't do real permitting reform through the reconciliation process, the budgetary process where you only need 50 votes in the Senate. You can't do permitting reform through that process. You really need to do it in a bipartisan way that requires moving through regular order. And you can't do it through executive action. Just because an administration that is friendly to your standpoint is in power doesn't mean they can make all these changes on their own. It has to be Congress that takes action. So don't wait to next Congress to think there will be a better deal. This is a good deal. It's been carefully negotiated by both sides. There's wins for both sides. Let's just lock it in and do it now. And so it's the same message. Ask them to support it and go to their leadership to push it over the finish line instead of waiting. All right, so what's the realistic path for EPA right now? Well, it passed the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee 15-4. Clearly a lot of bipartisan support. Don't get caught up in the fact that there's no House version. Everybody knows that the Senate version of the bill is going to form the core of the bill that gets tacked on any package. And that's the third thing. It will have to be attached to a package. Whatever's moving right now, the most likely vehicle for that is the CR, the continuing resolution to fund government. Leadership has to make that decision to attach bills to that. I mean, this is basically the last bus leaving the station. Everybody's going to try to pile on. This is our chance to get EPA on that bus. And so we're going to need a lot of bipartisan cooperation. And I really do believe next week is the key moment. It's really timely that we're coming up to DC to have these conversations virtually, but still going to DC, because I think the final decisions of what goes into that package are going to be happening next week. Senator-elect Curtis kind of alluded to the conversations that he couldn't talk about. We also have a lot of information that those conversations are happening. There is a lot of momentum about getting this, and the message we are also getting is that those meetings on outreach, members of Congress hearing from groups, advocates like you guys, is moving the needle towards attaching this bill. So we're making a big push, and I think next week is really going to be key, and we need to lean in there. And we just have to be realistic. The bill has compromises and wins, and there might be some extra compromises and there might be some extra wins that get inserted in this bill. But this is a really important opportunity to get an important climate win, and let's take it. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of good, and that should be the message to people that might be a little hesitant to push this bill now because they don't like some provisions. But overall, we know it's a good win for climate. So we also have a co-ask for Republicans, and this is, as you've heard, a lot of talk in IRA defense. Why do we want to do this? You've heard all this. IRA is good for the climate. it's good for business, it brings jobs. The message we want to bring to Republicans now is that it is good for the economy, it's good for businesses, it's creating jobs in their districts. That's what we want to focus on when we make this ask, to not, as Congressman Curtis said, like take to it with a sledgehammer, but like think about it as very strategic things that you might want to like keep and maybe even improve upon. Because I think it's worth, you can acknowledge in these meetings that no bill is perfect. I mean, we would not have wanted to move a bill through a partisan process, because you do then create some opposition later on. But as we talked about at the time, a lot of the clean energy provisions actually do have bipartisan support, and we're seeing that come out, like Senator Curtis. Going to take me a little bit to get through that since we're switching gears on him being moving from the House to the Senate. Those 18 members of Congress like already took that first step, and there's probably more that feel the same way. But as Congressman Curtis said, like it was a hard step, but so some people are probably like, we need to give them the motivation to step up and join those 18 that already put themselves out there and build a robust firewall to protect those provisions that we know are super important. When you're in these meetings, like focus on provisions that benefit your state and district the most. That's what members care about. They care about jobs that are happening. We have a lot of resources to help you like figure out what some of those things are on community. I suggest utilizing them and utilizing other resources out there to like figure out like what's the most beneficial thing that's happened because of the IRA in your state or district. And just like I said, like the lame duck's a weird creature. Well, it's the time to get things over the finish line, but it's also a time to start and tee things up for next Congress. This is the phase where like teeing things up for next Congress. That's where the action is going to happen on IRA defense. So we will be working a lot on this next Congress, and we'll talk more about that. One last thing, we do have one secondary ask. The RISE Act. Most of you are familiar with the RISE Act. It creates parity between offshore wind and offshore oil and gas drilling to return funding to communities and states for coastal resiliency and restoration. This is a really important bill. We've been working on it for almost 4 years now, and this is really the time where we might have the last chance to push over the finish line. And I think there's an opportunity for it to go on that public lands bill. If that moves, I think that's where the opportunity is. And in teeing that up, it just passed the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee a couple weeks ago to prepare for that opportunity. So we're asking, same thing with the other asks, take a look at RISE. It's a good bill. It's good for coastal states. It does have some benefits for interior states. It's good for the offshore wind industry to create incentives for states to want to develop that. And this could be the last opportunity. Insert it into one of these last end of the year packages. And those are 3 big lobbying asks that we really want you to concentrate on next week. All right. So now we can talk about next Congress. I know this is on everybody's mind. And I think Congressman Curtis really did a great job of setting forth a narrative of like how far we've come. But I think we do need to still think about other things that and how far we've come and think about where we started. And I'm kind of narcissistic, so I kind of base the world around. I joined CCL in 2017, so that's when the world starts for me. Thinking back to 2017, like we were living in a different world in Congress. Like it was like pulling teeth to get people to focus on climate. We had Republicans that didn't want to talk about it at all. It wasn't necessarily a priority for Democrats, but that has all changed. I mean, and I want to think about that first Trump administration. We had some wins then, and that's why I think we can get wins again. The bipartisan caucus was fairly new and young then, and during the first Trump administration, we grew that to almost 100 members, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats. That was a tremendous victory. We had our first 3 bills signed into law that we advocated for that was actually signed by President Trump at the end of his term. We had the first bipartisan carbon pricing bills introduced in those Congresses. So that was a proven thing that we can operate In this sort of environment, we can operate under a Trump administration and get wins and continue to reach across the aisle. I think we should also acknowledge the world has changed in many other ways as well. I mean, back then in 2017, we were selling like 98,000 EVs a year. Last year, I think in the United States, 1.3 million were sold. Like, we're seeing these changes already happen that we've helped facilitate. Energy is now the cleanest energy in the history of humanity. I mean, these are big changes, and we should be aware of, like, it changes like the dynamics of the way Congress works and the way our work is. The world is not static, and neither should we be. We've seen the bipartisan infrastructure bill pass. We've seen the IRA pass. I think the Growing Climate Solutions Act passing opened up the conversation around climate and agriculture in a way that we could never have expected 7 years ago. Now farmers like talk about climate. It's always talked about in the agriculture community now up here in DC as an opportunity. And like, so that had a big impact. And even just this year, we had passage of the Advance Act in a divided Congress where there was a lot of bipartisan support to lean in on nuclear energy because it is going to be so key to our clean energy future. So that's just to like lay the groundwork of like where we are now is a different place than we were in the last Trump administration, in a much better place. And so there's a lot more opportunity here. So elections have consequences. We have a new Congress coming in. We have a new administration. What does that mean? Well, we're back to one-party control, but it's an interesting kind of one-party control. We're seeing the narrowest House majority almost in history, where like the House in some ways might have to operate a lot more like the Senate traditionally does, where one member of the Senate can really gum up the works. The House is going to be in a similar position. So that is going to really shape the dynamics of this Congress, particularly in the House. What that also means is there's always a lot of grand ambitions when new Congresses are coming into town and new administration that we're going to do all this and we don't need to work in a bipartisan way. I mean, we saw that with even the last when Democrats had unified party control, like a lot of grand ambition, but then the reality sets in that there's factions within parties. There are groups that want one thing or another thing. There are rules to the way like things like budget reconciliation works for like the bird rule that things have to have a budgetary impact. So you can't do everything you want through reconciliation. Right now, I think some Republican leadership is talking about things that they absolutely can't do through reconciliation. And that's going to be a wake-up call. And then I think we'll move back to a more bipartisan space. But and even that disagreement, we see like these grand ambitions already. We see House Republican leadership, they have one vision for how they want to use the reconciliation process. They want to go big right in the beginning, pack everything they want to do into one package and start right out of the gate moving that package. The new majority leader, Senator Thune, said the other day in Republican meeting, he wants to take a two-step approach. He wants to have a smaller reconciliation package in the beginning and do border defense and some energy stuff, and then push the bigger reconciliation package that will deal with the Trump era tax cuts and other things further on in Congress. Now, you can't do endless reconciliation packages. Usually, if everything goes right, you can only do one a year. But because they didn't do a budget resolution for this fiscal year, they got two shots. So they can do this two-step process. But those are their two shots at reconciliation. But they'll have this debate of how to use those things. So what does this mean for us and what we can accomplish? Well, we've heard a lot about IRA defense. Like, I think that is going to be our real focus right out of the gate when Congress starts, because we know there's going to be this desire to move this package fast. And so that's where we want to start, IRA defense. But I think we have an opportunity to do a lot more than defense. I see opportunities around, even if we get a permitting package over the finish line now, I think there's still going to be a lot of emphasis on finding ways to make America able to build things in a way that protects the environment and protects communities, but works better. I don't think we're done with that. We know Congress is now going to kick the Farm Bill in the next Congress. So there's going to be opportunities there. And there's been a lot of momentum around finding bipartisan solutions to sequester more carbon And I think we'll have that debate as part of the Farm Bill and even as a standalone thing. I think it's evident when a couple weeks ago the House passed the Fix Our Forest Act. There was a lot of bipartisan support for doing something to manage our forests where we keep them from burning down. The House last week or a couple weeks ago passed a couple of geothermal bills that probably won't go anywhere, but they show where the momentum is, and that's why we've been focusing on the larger package that does include the geothermal provisions. But I think there's a place to continue to have conversations about geothermal. I think nuclear energy, and the big one, of course, is climate and trade. Congressman Curtis talked about it. Rachel talked about. We're going to have a great session that Danny Richter is going to do, where he's going to go in depth into this. We think this is a tremendous opportunity. You know, when we think about climate change, it really is a global issue, and trade could be one of the strongest tools we have to lower emissions globally. Right now, I think something like 25% of emissions are through trade. And so that's a big chunk of emissions if we can start influencing people's behavior. We're already seeing the EU CBAM start impacting the way other countries are making decisions about their carbon intensity. And if the United States has something similar, that's going to make a big impact. So we're going to do all these things near term. But we're still going to continue to work strategically towards a future domestic carbon price. We're not going to stop working on that. It just might look a little different. It might look more strategic, more targeted. You might not hear us talking about it every day, but no, we're having those conversations. We just went to a big meeting a couple days ago where we got together with a lot of smart people to talk about carbon pricing for 3 hours and figure out a way forward. We're going to keep doing that. And trust me, you'll hear and get some actions for you to take as well. And we're just going to continue to expand the bipartisan space for climate action because we know that helps us get wins. It's paid dividends throughout this Congress. It's going to continue to pay dividends. And lastly, going on a theme that Rachel had, I think we have an obligation to work on some of these things. So many groups are retreating. They have become so partisan. They've lost their ability to talk to or influence Republicans in any way. We have not. We have just grown our influence on both sides of the aisle. So I think we have a obligation to lean in right now and not just retreat to lawsuits or state level action. We need to pile on at the federal level and make sure that this is not a lost 2 years. This is 2 years of action and progress that we can look back on and be really proud. And with that, I will stop and take some questions.
Thank you, Ben. I think you can see all the emojis of love and support from our viewers here today. I have a couple things I've just been pulling together, a couple questions that both I've heard ahead of time and kind of lumping together some of them that are in the Q&A so far. First of all, can you just describe for us what it's like on the Hill right now? Because we have heard from some offices that they've already closed their office and staff is working from home. So what does it actually look like?
The lame duck is definitely a transitionary time for a lot of offices. Some members are retiring, some members lost their seats. If you were retired and you knew you weren't going to be retiring, you already don't have an office. They start that process. So like there is like a period of like finding a way to continue to work. And so it kind of works out well that we are doing virtual meetings because a lot of offices are always switched to purely virtual meetings because they don't have a space to meet. And it's always a strange time because you know, people lose majority shift, and so that makes some people really happy and some people really sad, and so like that all factors into the general mood. But I think right now among a lot of offices there is a desire to finish the year out strong and try to get as much accomplished as they can. And you might run into some offices that are a little blasé and just want to like finish up and go home, but let's push them more in that enthusiastic corner where they want to like get stuff done and feel like they really ended out the year strong.
Thank you. And now I know you just said this about the process for passing our asks, but I think it's worth repeating because there's a few people that are still confused. We won't see this through regular order with a Senate bill and then a House bill and co-sponsors like we're used to seeing. They will take it to their leadership, and who is that leadership and what's that process again?
It's a very muddled process. It's not necessarily a formal process. There's no formal process for taking things to leadership. It's really conversations. It's conversations on the House floor. It sometimes takes the form of letters. But when we're talking leadership, we're talking Senator Schumer in the Senate is really instrumental in moving this forward. And I think he is very supportive of trying to do this, has been working behind the scenes to make it happen. In the House, we're talking about Hakeem Jeffries and Speaker Johnson and Majority Leader Scalise. They all need to hear from their membership, and I mean their membership, Republican and Democratic members of Congress, that they want to see something move. And this really does take the form of a member being on the floor and going up to one of the members of the leadership team and saying, hey, I'd really like to see a bipartisan permitting package move this Congress. Can we get it attached to the CR? It's also sometimes in this particular thing, getting committee chairman to sign off on these provisions to move forward. But we already know that Senator Manchin and Senator Barrasso, the leaders of the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee, are the authors of the bill. They're working tremendously hard behind the scenes to move this. So it's not like they need to be convinced. They're going to other members, but it's also like members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. She probably needs to hear from members of her committee, but anybody in a leadership position needs to hear, but it's not a formal process. That's why we're not saying get co-sponsors, prepare for this hearing. There's not time for any of that. But a lot of times this does happen. If bills are positioned right at the end of the year, they can go into that package, and it's never a slam dunk, but this is our shot, so we're going to take it.
That's fantastic. There's a number of questions that are also things like, can you comment on our general, how CCL's approach can be helpful in the Trump administration, knowing that he has pledged to pull out of the Paris Agreement again, and that he's not a fan of environmental regulations. What kind of thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, no, I think our role becomes even more vital. I mean, one thing that we've always been pretty clear with is while we can cheer sometimes when regulations go into place that will lower emissions or do good things for the climate, emissions just aren't, I mean, regulations just aren't durable. We have seen this time and time again with almost everything. I remember I used to work on immigration stuff. Every different administration would have different regulations they would try to implement around some of the visa programs. And I would end up going back and forth every administration and rewriting stuff and submitting comments because the regulatory approach just doesn't stick in place. We saw that after Obama left. And so I think our focus on Congress has been the correct one because when Congress takes action, that is the most durable form of federal action. And so that's what we want to see. And I think that should be our approach with the Trump administration as well. Focus on Congress. And we built this bipartisan coalition that wants to see things get done. And that's what we can utilize right now.
Thank you. Well, the most upvoted question in our Q&A, we still have lots of fans of carbon pricing, and you mentioned that we'll be talking about it differently. There's a question of, can we use the quote from Elon Musk in February of 2024 as a message to connect to Republicans? And that quote is, the only action needed to solve climate change is a carbon tax. It's economics 101.
Well, we might lean into that at some time. Maybe not this lobby day, but I mean, I think that's when we talk about thinking and acting strategically and building these coalitions around a domestic carbon price that's really durable and accepting the fact that the world has changed since the Energy Innovation Act was originally introduced. And we want to take some of those ideas take some of these potential new allies and think how to utilize that and really think about how do we utilize things like Musk's apparent support for a carbon price now that he has such an influential position within the White House to really push the conversation forward. And those are the things we really want to think about.
There's also a question here about the Department of Government Efficiency. I think that's the one they're referring to. And whether we think that might get in the way of our plans or the president's plans.
This really goes to that where, like I say, every administration, Congress has grand ambitions, and they're going to do everything, and they'll do it on day one, and then they run into the reality of Washington, D.C. I think some of that will definitely filter into that department. It's not really a department yet. I'll call it a committee, because they're not really versed in the ways of Washington. The other thing is a lot of these things have to be done by Congress. and every member has their different position and different constituencies that they have to make happy, and it's not universal across parties. And especially with these narrow majorities, I think you're going to see a lot of uh, they're going to have to slow down. But at the same time, I think there is bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle to make government work better. I think when we talk about permitting reform, there is an interest to make things more responsive to constituents. I mean, I've heard even Republicans talking about in the context of permitting reform, making it work better for communities that are impacted. And so I think there is this momentum behind the idea like we need to make everything in the United States work better so we can outcompete our rivals internationally and just make life better for American citizens. I think that is shared across the aisle, and I think we can work with that.
Yeah, thank you. And that's such a good keeping us on track, that how we keep from being distracted by everything going on is remember that we are focused on Congress, and that's where things will happen.
I always think back to your head like when you get to maybe we'll have the recording of Congressman Curtis's talk that everybody can refer to and think, no, this is the direction we want to head in, and we're getting this positive affirmation that the way we work does work. And I can tell you, when I walk around and I talk to people, I always say I have the best job at CCL because I get to hear and see firsthand that the work you guys are doing is being impactful. And I'll be on conference calls, and somebody will say, like, yeah, CCL volunteers were already in this office, and the only reason they signed on to this bill was because the CCL volunteers asked them to. I hear that all the time, so I know it's working.
Yeah, definitely a power of citizen lobbyists. Thank you. And speaking of Senator-elect Curtis, we talked about his support for the Prove It Act, and so folks are wondering, what's the current status of the Prove It Act?
Yes, and this is something we should find a better way to like keep people abreast of, like because we do have these asks that you go, oh, like what happened with them? Well, the Prove It Act is in kind of an interesting place. It kind of served the purpose we wanted to serve. It got a lot of bipartisan support. It kicked off a lot more of this conversation about border carbon tariffs, um, that could lead to something bigger, which is what we always wanted to do. And so now the Prove It Act is kind of in this weird phase of like, it did something we need to do. It's still affecting things behind the scenes, but we don't really need a lobby on it anymore to make it have the impact we want it to happen. Like we did our good job. We should kind of pat ourselves on the back that it did um, garner so much support in the House. A lot of people did not think we'd get that many Republicans on it, and that's one of those bills that I heard a lot of the Republicans that jumped on because of CCL. Um, and so like you might hear more about it, but it's not such a live issue. I think now in the next Congress we'll really be talking more about like climate and trade and what are the things that will actually implement and move a carbon border tariff where we're actually lowering emissions. You have to remember Prove It Act was just a report kind of laying the groundwork. So we've kind of done that work. And on just some of these secondary asks generally, we should follow up on that we had hoped to be able to provide a more better conclusion to things like the TSP Access Act that you guys lobby on. Like that made it into both drafts of the Republican versions of the Farm Bill. So we're pretty sure it's in a good place to be in whatever Farm Bill passes. The same thing with seedlings for sustainable habitat. That made it into the underlying bill text that will form the basis of the Farm Bill they're going to be talking about. So we've kind of like already achieved the win, but it's hard to talk about that win when it's still in draft form. If they had passed the Farm Bill like they should have done this year, we'd be saying, yep, we passed TSP Access Act and we passed Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat. But we've already achieved that victory. We just haven't achieved the final victory.
Thank you. And speaking of other legislation that we have worked on, there was also a question about whether big wires that we've worked on in the past, is that a part of the Energy Permitting Reform Act?
So yes, a good portion of big wires went into EPRA. There's a whole section EPRA in the transmission section about interstate, interregional planning, and that's pretty much taken directly from big wires. So we've had a win there already. The part of big wires that didn't make it in that we will look for ways to think about how to like do this other ways is the minimum transfer requirements between regions. We really thought that would be impactful, and some of the emissions modeling do state that minimum transfer requirements between regions would really be helpful and have an impact. So we might be looking at other ways to get those provisions over the finish line in a different form.
Another thing, Congressman or Senator-elect Curtis brought up was his work on really making more bipartisan space for action. And there's also a question about potential threats to climate science through NOAA and things like that. So when we see some of those kinds of things that feel like they could be an attack on science and on what we rely on to move conversations forward, what do you see as some good opportunities for really expanding that space for bipartisan action, and maybe even more specifically, like how do we help encourage Republicans in really claiming their space on this topic?
Yeah, I think we do need to monitor that stuff very carefully and make sure that if there are threats to the scientific discourse that we know that we needs to produce products that we can rely on and monitor and measure this stuff that's very important to our work. We need to be ready to like jump in but and potentially play some defense in those areas as well, not just necessarily IRA. And another thing is, sometimes there's more quiet support for things that people don't realize on both sides of the aisle that they just don't come up when you're not normally nobody's going to be walking around saying like how much they support Noah because it's just taken for granted that it's there. But that if you think about removing it and all those consequences it could have, especially for places that are hit by natural disasters and climate and things like that, they're going to get really concerned about that really fast, and all of a sudden you will see a natural constituency like come out of Congress to defend them. But I mean, just for an instance, in early meetings years ago, I remember in a meeting talking about carbon pricing and trying to get Republicans to engage. And one Republican office said, how about the trade-off is we get rid of the EPA and you guys get a carbon price, which was not something we would advocate for. But another Republican office that was in that meeting said, no, 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 no. There's no way we're going to touch the EPA. We need that. We know how important environmental regulations are to keep our water clean and our constituents safe. And they would say, like, that's a red line for us. So like that's kind of the behind the scenes play that I think will come out more when if something is actually threatened.
And I think that's also an important point, that we can't lump all Republicans together. We can't lump all Democrats together, right? That each office, we just need to keep digging in with those open-ended questions to really find out what their thinking is, because we might be surprised, it sounds like, with things that we think we might hear, and it might not really be that.
Yeah, and I think we're really entering a new phase as well, not to get on my soapbox, of where climate is not doesn't break down neatly along partisan lines because we now know permitting reform is a great example. There's definitely opposition on within the Democratic Party for making it easier to build anything, even clean energy. And so we see a lot more opposition almost on the left than on the right for permitting reform, but we know how important it is to reach our climate goals. And so I think depending on the issue, we'll see a lot more of that. I mean, Republicans have always been more forward facing on nuclear energy, but now we're seeing Democrats come over, but it's like they needed the push, not necessarily Republicans on nuclear. So I think we'll see that dynamic play out a lot more as we look at like solutions that really do lower emissions.
Mhm. One more question on EPRA is, there's some questions about the mining provisions and whether that's a concern for us, or how much are we digging into specific provisions at this point, or is that totally out of our hands and we just are pushing for them to come up with a compromise?
I mean, at this point, the compromise is the compromise. There's not going to be an amendment process. It was a very carefully negotiated compromise to bring that bill together to get both sides to the table. And I always like to point out when people are concerned about the mine provisions, is it actually was taken from Democratic language. This was a Democratic bill that the mining language came from because there was a recognition that the Rosemont decision impacted all mining operations in the United States, and made it very difficult to potentially operate any mine. We know minerals are going to be key to the clean energy transition. And so I think that's a bipartisan piece of legislation that both sides want to see move forward, even though it causes some heartburn, just mining in general causes some heartburn for the environmental movement. But we also know it's kind of necessary. And I really do think it's key to the bill moving. And that's one of those provisions, for instance, you can't do that through reconciliation. that has to be a bill that like moves through regular order. It's not a budgetary thing. So like when you're talking to Republicans, like if they really care about those mining provisions, you can't do it through reconciliation. You can't do it through executive action.
And what would you say is the best argument for Republican offices to pass this now rather than waiting for the next Congress? I know you outlined a few, but what would
Yeah, I
be the
mean,
top
it's those
argument?
processes. It's also like the idea that you're going to get a better deal in a new Congress. A lot of times backfires, because there's no world. I think Congressman Buddy Carter at an event a couple weeks ago really talked about the fact. This was before the election. He's like, you know what? There are so everything's so narrowly divided. He's like, I think the days of being able to do the big things through partisan processes are over. He said, I think we're always going to have to work across the aisle to get big things done. So they're still going to have to work across the aisle to get things done if they really want to get something done on permitting. And so why not take the win now? I mean, it's been negotiated. It's passed through the Senate. I mean, this was a bill that was negotiated by who is now going to be the #2 in Senate leadership. Senator Barrasso negotiated this bill. I mean, this has buy-in from both sides. There's really not a good reason to wait unless you just, I think, kind of fancifully think you're going to be able to just get whatever you want 100% with none of the compromise next Congress. I just don't think that's the reality, and we have to try to like gently, respectfully push that narrative on some of these offices.
All right, I think I have time for one more quick question. Who opposes the RISE Act and why?
Well, there's just with Rise, there's some opposition, because it does acknowledge that offshore drilling continues and those revenues do go to states. And so some groups don't like that even an acknowledgement that offshore fuel production will continue. So that's where some of the opposition comes from. The other opposition comes from, it does score pretty big as far as like its cost, because what it's doing is it's channeling money that is now going from offshore wind leases into the general treasury. It's sending some of that money back to states. So the way things are scored, that shows as like a cost to the federal government, even though the federal government's really not spending any money because they're losing revenue. It shows that. So there's a need to create an offset for the bill. An offset has been identified, but it's not really known what that offset is. The offices are being very cagey, but leadership has identified an offset. We can't really talk about it, but we know it's there. And there is support from leadership for moving RISE. It's also one of those things. It's just there's so many congressional priorities. There's so many things that people want to get in to packages that it's also just trying to like make a break from the crowd, and that's where we can be impactful in this final push of having all these meetings and saying, hey, by the way, tack on RISE. It's a good bill. It's good for coastal communities. It's good for inland states. And it will really grow the offshore wind industry is a really, really important message to have right now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.